Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to this special broadcast on Sansad TV. I am Tina Jha. India is all set to host the G20 Leaders Summit on the 9th and 10th of September in New Delhi. Now this will be a culmination of over 200 meetings that have taken place over the past 1 year in as many as 60 cities across the country among ministers, senior officials as well as civil societies. Also, at the conclusion of the 18th summit, there will be a G20 leaders declaration that will be adopted stating the commitment of the leaders of the G20 towards the priorities that have been discussed and agreed upon in the respective ministerial and working group meetings. So what will be these priorities? What are the key expectations from the 18th G20 summit in New Delhi? Also, what is it that India's G20 presidency will be remembered for? All this and much more in conversation with a distinguished guest today who is joining us on the broadcast. I'm delighted to have with me on this special telecast on Sansad TV, the Ambassador of Mexico to India, Mr. Federico Salas. Thank you, Ambassador, for your time. Welcome to Sansad TV.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
You know, the G20 Leaders Summit is right here. Let me begin by asking you, India under its presidency has had a very action-oriented, a development-oriented agenda. How does Mexico look at India's approach and priorities as the G20 chair?
Well, we have been, by and large, very supportive of India's approach and the priorities, as you correctly mentioned. I think they coincide very much with the same ones that we have in Mexico, and especially with the one thing that we're very supportive of is the fact that they should be action-oriented. I think that many of the you know, there's no commitment. I mean, there's no link to to make whatever is adopted compulsory for the countries of the G20. So we need to be more, you know, more practical, more pragmatic, and that's where the action-oriented approach comes into being. And it's very important because I think that we need to translate some of those, you know, the priorities and the approach that we have to resolving some of the major challenges of the world community today into practical effect. And this, you know, has to do with issues of development, of you know, financial stability, climate change, but also questions having to do with health, with energy, with tourism, with agriculture, with women empowerment. And along these lines, along all these subjects, Mexico has worked very closely with India, and I think, as I said, we have been very supportive of the priorities that India has set up for each one of these different subjects.
So when you say translating these priorities into decisive measures, what is the kind of support that we can expect from Mexico?
Well, we have worked very closely with the Indian presidency in drafting and negotiating the different statements that have come out of the different groups that have been taking place in the past 9 months. As you correctly said, there were over 200 meetings in many cities of India. Mexico has participated, and we have been, as I said, very helpful with the Indian presidency in reaching outcomes that have a consensus within the group, and that I think is very important. I think that whatever will be the outcome of the summit would also be, you know, has to highlight precisely all of these commitments that have been taking place in the different working groups that met over the past 9 months. And of course, it's up to every country to actually do something about the commitments that we're going to adopt. I think that in the case of Mexico, you can count on the fact that we will do our best to bring them to fruition, and that we will continue working very closely with future presidencies of the G20. Next year will be Brazil, which is very close to Mexico, then South Africa, and this is something that is a commitment that we've had all along since the creation of the G20, to try to make sure that our commitments are actually, you know, turn into practical results.
India's G20 presidency, Ambassador, as we're all aware, comes at an extremely challenging time. There have been two black swan events, first the COVID pandemic, followed by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. What tangible outcomes do you see in this challenging scenario coming out of the G20 summit? Also a related question, you know, since we've spoken about how both these challenges have had detrimental impact on the larger part of the world, both the pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, how well do you see India having navigated through these challenges and kept the focus of the G20 strictly on issues of economic cooperation and other global problems like food insecurity, like issues of global health, etc.?
I think India has done a very good job under very difficult circumstances, as you correctly say, because it's not only the post-pandemic period that we are living, the context of the conflict that is taking place in Europe, but also all of the effects that this has had in the world community, and the question of, for example, energy prices, food prices, and food shortages that have ensued because of this type of issues. The question of availability of fertilizers, and of course the financial problems that this has created, particularly with inflation in many of our countries. So in this very complex context, I think India has navigated the waters, I would say, relatively successfully. And one thing that we should not focus on is that even though there are some issues that may not have they're not necessarily going to have a resolution within the G20, because the G20 is not necessarily the forum where these issues are going to be resolved. But on many other issues, on a large number of subjects, we have reached consensus. All the 20 countries that are members of the G20 plus the invited countries. And that, I think, is a very remarkable success already before the summit.
When you talk about the success of the G20 summit, India's constant effort has been to make G20 more inclusive, more representative. And for this, India initiated the Voice of the Global South Summit in January this year. And now India is insisting on the inclusion of the African Union into the G20 summit. How does Mexico look at this idea of India of having an expanded G20? And do you see this as a possible outcome of the G20 summit?
Well, I think it's very, I think what India did has been very important. The fact that in January the Prime Minister held this meeting with, I think, 125 countries from the Global South, basically to hear what their priorities are, what their concerns are, and bring those to the table of the G20 was very important, because many of the decisions that are taken by the G20 are applicable not just to the countries that are sitting around the table, but have an impact around the world. So it is important to realize, what everybody else is thinking and what are their concerns. At the same time, you have to take into account that many of the countries of the G20, like Mexico, like India, we are part of the Global South. So we also represent, we have those voices that are present within the group. So I think, whether there will be an expansion of the group or not, I don't know. We'll have to see at the end of this week. But I think it's very important that we are conscious of the fact that we have to be attentive to the voices of the many other countries that are part of the international community, and for which many of our decisions as G20 members are actually committed to.
With the kind of efforts that have been made, Ambassador, not just by India, but also by the BRICS in terms of expanding and in terms of bringing in more countries that wanted representation, do you think with these efforts we will actually get to see more participation from a lot of this underrepresented world who are impacted but they find no representation at the international fora?
Well, I think you also have to take into account that one of the priorities that India has set up is to strengthen the multilateral system. And the multilateral system, basically the United Nations, everybody's in there. So I think that what is very important is that regardless of different groups that have limited membership, the truth of the matter is that many of the decisions, of the actions that we commit to will also be reflected in actions that we'll take to the multilateral fora, like the United Nations. And that's, and everybody's there, everybody participates there. So I'm quite confident that this question of inclusiveness is basically accounted for. But what I also think is very important is that we should not lose track of the fact that we do need to strengthen the existing multilateral organizations such as the United Nations.
India, as you know, Ambassador, believes in Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which means the world is one family, and all our efforts have been aimed at that. That happens to be our motto as well during the G20 presidency. And through various means, the effort is on bringing people together through culture, through films, through food, etc. You've traveled across different cities during the past 9 to 10 months for the G20 meetings. What is the kind of effort that you see India having undertaken to strengthen and promote this aspect, this relationship with the rest of the world?
Well, I think that one thing that India did in a very splendid way is showcase its very magnificent and very diverse and very rich culture in all of these meetings, because they all included either cultural performances of different sorts or also visits to some of the most, the amazing sites that India has. It has, 40 sites in the World Heritage List of UNESCO, and, many of the delegates that came for the G20 meetings had the opportunity to visit some of these sites. But also now, as we are approaching the summit, India has opened up the possibility of bringing in artistic manifestations, cultural manifestations from all the countries that are participating. Mexico is participating. We already had a film festival that has been taking place in the past week or so. There's going to be an exhibit in the venue of the G20 itself with different iconic pieces from the different countries that are participating in the G20. The National Gallery of Art here in Delhi is also hosting a multi-country exhibit, and Mexico is again participating, and I encourage everyone to visit both in the exhibit at the National Gallery and eventually in the Pragati Mayan after the summit. That I think will stay there for a couple of months, that people can come and see, because what that does is tell us that we are countries, we are political entities that are talking about these very important issues, but at the same time we're all very rich cultures. We have a very diverse background, and we can all bring to the table also the richness of that. Now, coming to what you said about the culture group that met, that I think was also a very successful meeting, particularly in two aspects which I think are very important both for India and for Mexico. One of them is the protection of our natural heritage by fighting against illicit trafficking of archaeological objects, for example, artistic objects in general, that belong to us, to our history, to our peoples, to our craftsmen in general. And secondly is precisely the protection of the work that is being done at the crafts level, particularly, but not only, but through different types of measures that will assure that there are not kind of like the copyright in a way is not stolen or perverted, and this is something that I think was very important. I think that there was a general agreement in that regard in the culture working group, and it's something that certainly countries like India and Mexico that have such a rich cultural background are very keen on.
At another G20 meeting, Ambassador, that of G20 Trade and Investment Ministers meeting in Jaipur, the Indian Prime Minister spoke about the need to have more inclusive and resilient global value supply chains. And for this, he insisted that we draw a framework of mapping global value chains. We've all seen the kind of experience during the COVID pandemic. Do you think it's time the G20 step up efforts to have more resilient global value chains and something which can withstand future shocks?
Yeah, I think that it's unfortunate that sometimes we need a crisis in order to learn how to move towards the future. And I think that the COVID crisis did show us that this whole question of the value chains is something that we need to work on. And I think that this initiative by the Prime Minister Modi, and I think that also had a very widespread agreement. We need to shield ourselves from future shocks that would affect these value chains in the production of all sorts of goods, in the supply of food, in the supply of medicines, for example, which it's a key element. And I think that in that sense, you also find an overall agreement in the G20 countries that this is definitely something that we need to do something about. The commitment is there. We'll have to look at the practical elements, how we put this into effect. But I think that it's an important first step in the right direction.
In addition to the global value chains being resilient, our Prime Minister also spoke about the need to have resilient global health systems, and something again that we learned from the COVID pandemic. Now, based on our vision of One Earth, One Health, that envisages good health for the entire ecosystem, the Prime Minister spoke about a global initiative on digital health. What are your views on the benefits that it is going to have for the rest of the world, especially the countries in the global south?
Yeah, I think one thing that was very important in the health ministerial meeting was how India presented what it has done in terms of digital health, and it's tremendously impressive. And I can tell you something, that countries like Mexico, and as I said, let me underline again that we're part of the global south, we're very much interested in what India has done and is doing, and emulating the type of work that has been done here in India, which is tremendously successful and very useful to make sure that all the population, even in remote areas and in marginalized areas, gets access to good health systems, to medicines, and services of all kinds. So that, I think, is very, very important. And I'm sure that India has shown enormous generosity in bringing that type of knowledge, that type of infrastructure to different countries around the world. It showed that during the pandemic by distribution of vaccines around the world, and I think that in this case, this new aspects of digital health, I think they're more than willing to share the expertise that they have in that field. Again, it's there's many issues that will have to be resolved along the way, but I can tell you, one thing for sure, that we in Mexico are very keenly interested in what India has been doing and hope to be able to do something similar.
Another important aspect that I would like you to talk about, Ambassador, is the fact that the COVID pandemic and then followed by the Russia-Ukraine war did undo a lot of the global efforts that we achieved on sustainable development goals. So what is the kind of focus that the G20 member countries now have towards advancement in accomplishing these sustainable development goals?
Well, I think this was a common issue in most of the working groups, if not all of the working groups that took place before the summit that is approaching at the end of this week, which is that we're sort of halfway time-wise in terms of the achievement of the sustainable development goals of the 2030 UN agenda. So we're sort of halfway there in terms of years, but not halfway there in terms of actually getting there to the commitments where we are. And I think that in all of the working groups, one issue that was a common denominator is, what do we have to do to accelerate our commitments in order to catch up in time and make sure that we reach 2030 with full commitments to the achievement of all of these goals. And I think that what we have now is a renewed commitment. This is something that India was very emphatic about, to bring that issue as a transversal issue in all of these items. I think it was successfully done, and we're all committed to it. And hopefully, will implement what we have committed to.
We spoke about the milestone numbers in terms of 200 meetings across 60 cities of India and discussing various issues, various global problems. And you were part of a lot of these meetings. One quintessential moment that you think stands out and for which India's G20 presidency will be remembered?
Oh, that's. I think there wasn't one. There were many. I think that the culmination of each one of the ministerial groups in the outcome documents was particularly important, because you could see that the people that had been working on this for many months, to see their achievement finally realized was very, very important. To see those smiles and those expressions of satisfaction of having achieved this, and more importantly also to see the relief on the part of the Indian presidency of each one of these meetings at having reached that goal, and I think that was very important.
That was about India's G20 presidency, Mexico's support to India in making it successful, and the kind of expectations that we have from the 18th G20 summit. Let's now very quickly talk about India-Mexico relations. Mexico was the first Latin American country to recognize India post her independence. The fact that over the years we've shared warm, cordial relations, We both share a common history of ancient civilization. We have commonalities in terms of our food as well. But overall, now in the current context, we see that we are both emerging large economies with similar socio-economic development priorities and constraints. So in the current context, if we look at this scenario, how do you see both countries converging more on issues of mutual interest?
Well, I think that in the past decade or so, our relationship has grown and strengthened and diversified much more than it did since post-independent India, in the decades post-independent India. And I think that that's a very important aspect of it. One of the things that I think should be highlighted is that we have a closer economic integration than one would expect. There's over 200 Indian businesses in Mexico, based in Mexico, for example. We have become India's #1 trading partner in Latin America. Mexico is the largest investor from Latin America here in India. So in spite of the distance, and sometimes in spite of the fact that we don't know each other that much, or our peoples don't know each other that much, there is an increased closeness and affinity that is being productive and very useful to both of our countries. I think there's much that we can learn from each other, because as you correctly mentioned, we have similar challenges for the development of our societies. And even though there's a difference in size, Mexico is about 1/10 the size of India, nevertheless, those challenges are there. And we, I think we can learn from the best practices of what we have done in Mexico, what you have done in India. And this is something that we're working very strongly for here at the bilateral level at the embassy, in terms of strengthening the political dialogue that we have, the cooperation that we have with different institutions between Mexico and India, including, for example, space. We have our space agency in Mexico has been cooperating with ISRO here in Israel, and we're very happy to see that India just reached the moon recently. So it's very important that we continue this, because, as I said, there's much that we can learn from each other.
You're right. It's been a splendid week for ISRO. We became the first country to land on the south pole of the moon. Yes. We've just launched our first solar mission, the Aditya L1. So if I talk about this area of space science and technology, how do you see we can elevate our ties in the times to come? How can we deepen our space science and technology cooperation?
Well, I think that's in the process of happening. We've had a long-standing relationship with the Space Agency of India. We have a memorandum of understanding, but with which we added upon a new MOU just in the past year or so to deal, for example, space view of natural disasters, especially like forest fires and things like that. This is particularly important. If we see what's happening around the world in places like Canada, or what happened in Hawaii recently, of course these are issues that are of tremendous concern for countries like India and Mexico. So this is the type of cooperation that we're working on, and it's being strengthened. We're discussing, our scientists are discussing what other areas we can work in and benefit from as we look from space towards our respective countries.
Do you think in the India-Mexico relationship there is still untapped potential? There are newer avenues of cooperation that we could look for in the times to come?
Absolutely. There's new areas, and I think we're exploring new areas, but of course something new happens all the time. But for example, aside from this kind of the traditional aspects of a bilateral relationship, the political dialogue, the commercial, the investment, the cultural, the academic exchanges, etc., one of the things that we're working on very strongly now with India is the whole question of the innovation sector. Question of communication and dialogue between the startups of Mexico and India. India, of course, has become one of the large incubators of startups in the world, and we also have our share in Mexico that are very important. So we're looking at India to see things that we can learn in terms of innovation, in terms of artificial intelligence, and more importantly, and one thing that India has done so well and so effectively is the whole question of digitalization of payments, of health services, and other areas. And this is something that we want to learn, that we want to see how we can, in Mexico, we can benefit from that. On the more sort of trade and industrial related aspect, for example, the whole question of electrical vehicles. It's something, again, that we're working very closely now with India in terms of the type of technology that will be necessary to also bring to Mexico. We're already doing it, but bring more to Mexico in terms of electrical vehicles, batteries for automobiles and buses, etc., and that type of thing. And one third aspect that I should mention is also the question of cooperation in the pharmaceutical sector. And it's not just the issue of what can we buy from India, which we do. We buy pharmaceutical products, including vaccines, from India. But we also want to have joint research, research into future advances for medicine. And this is something, again, that we're doing at the level of the pharmaceutical industries of both countries. So these are new areas, new avenues of cooperation. We're working and moving in that direction very aggressively.
Absolutely. We're hopeful that we will be able to elevate our ties in all of these areas that you just spoke about. But when we talk about bilateral ties between countries, what strengthens this bond is the people-to-people ties. And since we have a lot of commonalities, what exactly are India and Mexico doing to promote and strengthen people-to-people ties?
Well, I think there's a large effort being done on both sides to bring cultural aspects of our respective countries to the other. And I think that's very important, because that helps us to know each other better, to appreciate each other better, and it increases the people-to-people contact and dialogue that we should have. We've had, even throughout the pandemic, for example, we have virtual meetings to discuss different aspects of our culture. We had even some, for example, something that may be a bit arcane, but was very, very useful and very rich. Dialogue between poets from Mexico and poets from India, many of which were working also in translation into the Spanish. But more than that, I mean, certainly we're looking towards the future to bring more of our cinema and of our artistic manifestations here to India, and we're of course looking forward to have more of that in Mexico. I've also noticed that in Mexico a lot of new Indian restaurants have opened up, so we're benefiting from the different variety and the richness of Indian food. I'm trying to bring to India more Mexican food. There's only a few scattered restaurants around the country, but hopefully in the not so distant future, we'll have more of a presence of Mexican food here. Already, however, I must say, tequila has become a very popular drink around India. I'm very happy to see that. It's a wonderful spirit, and it's something that in Mexico for us is very dear to us, and it comes as part of the legacy of hundreds of years in Mexico. So we're very happy that we can share this with our Indian friends.
I'll take one last question, since you spoke about restaurants and how both countries and peoples should embrace each other's food. I would like to take the opportunity to ask you, you've been here in India for more than 4 years now. What is your favorite Indian cuisine, sir?
Oh, again, that's a difficult question. But I think there's two places where I think I've tasted very different Indian cuisine. One of them was in Ladakh, which was very interesting, the offerings they have there, and the other was in the south, in Kerala, so in the two extremes of the country. But I must say that I like everything in between. I'm very fond of Indian food, and many years ago, before I came to India, before I knew that I was ever going to be posted here, one of my great passions was to go to Indian restaurants wherever I was visiting. So I'm very happy to be able here to enjoy Indian food of all sorts of all the different regions of India.
We're glad to hear that you're having a wonderful stay here in India. So with that, we'll have to close up this program. Thank you once again, Ambassador. It's been a delight to interact with you about different aspects of India's G20 presidency, about the expectations, the outcome, the possible outcome from the 18th G20 summit, which will be held later this week in New Delhi, and also speaking to us at length about the existing India-Mexico relations and how we can elevate our ties further in the times to come. Absolute pleasure to have you with us on Sansad TV.
Thank you very much.
So that's it from us on this program, viewers. Thank you very much for your time as well.